CHAPTER XIV of The Widow Married, a sequel to The Widow Barnaby by Francis Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER XIV. The O'Donagough family become popular, and are the centre of a circle. Miss Patty forms a very important friendship, and opens her young heart with all the frankness of her age and character. During the fortnight which followed, General and Mrs. Hubert, with their eldest daughter, were absent from Brighton on a visit at a friend's house about 20 miles distant. Mrs. O'Donagough considered this as a most unfortunate contretemps, and bewailed her ill luck accordingly. But to say the truth, neither her husband nor her daughter shared her sorrow. Mr. Allen O'Donagough was perfectly satisfied for the present by having convinced himself that no floating vision of Major Allen existed in any cell of memory, either with the General or his lady, which could be called to light and life again by looking at him. It was not then and it was not there, however, that he hoped to profit by the acquaintance, and he was quite as well pleased to be left just at first in the free and unobserved enjoyment of his restoration to the pastimes of Auld Lang Syne, without having before his eyes the fear of not being sufficiently aristocratical in the estimation of General Hubert. As to Miss Patty, the intensity of her happiness was much too great to leave room for anything like regret. Sallying forth at least 6 times in every day, sometimes in one smart set of ribbons, and sometimes in another, sure each time of meeting lots of men, as she remarked to her mamma, who did nothing but stare at her as long as she was in sight, how could she fail to await with patience the coming on of the adventures which she was determined to have some day or other with those 2 darlings who had bowed to Elizabeth? She did wait with patience, or rather she could hardly be said to wait at all, for every hour of every day had its allotted joy, till at last she ceased to care about those 2 young fellows at all. No sooner was breakfast over every sunshiny morning, than either father or mother were told that they must come with her to the pier, and either father or mother obeyed, nothing loth, sharing with parental pride in her delight, as every eye followed her in her laughing, bounding, ringlet-shaking, ribbon-fluttering course. "That's Dacre, mamma. Ain't he beautiful? He's major in the . The maid says he is going to be married, but I'll be hanged if I believe a word of it. He didn't ought to look that way at me, mamma, if he's going to be married, did he?" may be quoted as one among 1,000 speeches which prove the amiable tone of confidential familiarity which existed at this time between Mrs. O'Donagough and her daughter, and it would be doing the fond mother injustice, were it not added, that all such outpourings of her young daughter's heart were welcomed with a sort of joyous sympathy, which fostered and strengthened every feeling they displayed. Nor was Mr. Allen O'Donagough a whit less indulgent to his blooming heiress. Not, indeed, that she so frequently made him the confidant of her military speculations as her mother; on the contrary, his presence generally acted in some degree as a check on her communications in this line. Nevertheless, there were not wanting a multitude of occasions on which his affection and her influence were displayed. She made him subscribe to both the principal libraries, because, as she said, it was so abominably provoking to know that anybody that one particularly wanted to see was lounging at either, and not be able to go in, and sit down for a little while, if one liked it. She repeatedly coaxed him to take places at the theatre for herself and her mamma, though he protested that the lamps made his head ache so much that he could not stay with them, but this want of gallantry was fully atoned for, by his making acquaintance at the billiard table with 1 lieutenant and 2 ensigns, whom he brought home to play whist, and eat lobster salad, twice in the course of the week; thereby putting the keystone to his daughter's triumphant felicity, by giving her the chance, every time she went out, that 3 officers in full uniform might turn round on meeting her and her mamma, and clank their swords upon the pavement beside them for as many blessed moments as they could spare. In short, Patty felt convinced that it was impossible to have a better father, and had the point been still unsettled, his conduct in a little scene which took place after they had been in Brighton about a week, would have put the matter quite out of doubt. "Papa," said the lively girl one morning, as they amused themselves by standing together to watch the bathers, "Papa, you must let me bathe." "Bathe, Patty?" exclaimed Mr. O'Donagough in reply. "What on earth should you bathe for? Why, you are the very picture of health, child, and a very pretty picture too, I must say. Better let well alone, Patty. The sea may tan your nice skin for what I know." "Not it, papa," cried Patty, snapping her fingers gaily in his face. "My skin will bear more than that before it is spoiled, I'll answer for it. And bathe I must, papa.
Upon my word and honour, I must. Now do just look at those heads bobbing up and down, and peeping round to look at each other. Isn't that capital fun now? Indeed, indeed, papa, you must let me bathe, and if you don't, I won't mind a single word you say about wearing shabby things out of sight or anything else for a month to come. You had better mind what I say at once, Pappy," added the young lady, mimicking her mamma's constant phrase when lecturing herself, and only substituting Pappy for Patty at the end of it. This last sally was more than the father could withstand. The mimicry was excellent, and his enjoyment of it so great, that he swayed himself backwards and forwards upon the sea rail, over which he hung till his daughter seized the flaps of his coat to pull him back, lest he should fall over it. " You little devil, you !" burst from him as soon as he could recover his voice. " I should like to see the man that could say you nay. And so you must bathe, must you? And bob your handsome head up and down among the rest of them? And so you shall, saucy one, if you like. Only it must not be above once a week, Miss Patty, remember that, for it comes deuced dear, I promise you." In short, in one way or another, the first week and the second week wore pleasantly away, notwithstanding the absence of their great relations, and considerably before the expiration of the fortnight, Mrs. O'Donagough herself confessed, that much as she doted upon her darling Agnes, Brighton was a very delightful place, even though she was not there to enjoy it with her. The daily increasing intimacy between Mr. O'Donagough and the sporting portion of the officers quartered in and near the town, had unquestionably much to do with this general family feeling that Brighton was the most agreeable place in the world. But about 3 days after the departure of the Huberts, another circumstance occurred which greatly enhanced their enjoyment of it. In the same house with the O'Donagough family, occupying the front parlour as their sitting room, lodged two young ladies, sisters of an uncertain age, but of the most certain decorum and respectability. The windows of their parlour, commanding as they did the approach to the house door, and a full unbroken view of the steps leading to it, enabled these young ladies to form a very just and accurate estimate of the number and quality of the guests who visited the family in the drawing room. "Tell me who are your friends, and I will tell you what you are," was a proverb, the recondite wisdom of which was familiar to the minds of both the sisters, and it would have been difficult to find an occasion on which it would have been more profitably applicable. A few days of diligent observation, followed by a clear-headed logical deduction of conclusions from premises, enabled the two Miss Perkinses to decide, beyond the possibility of a doubt, that the O'Donagoughs were persons of high consideration, and the most unquestionable respectability. In the first place, the approach of General Hubert's stylish servant had been noted, commented upon, and duly estimated ; and when the visit of the General himself and his lady followed, whose names and persons were as well known to the whole motley mass of Brighton elegance as those of royalty itself, the vicinity of such neighbours became matter of very serious importance indeed. Then quickly followed the information, on the unquestionable authority of the maid of the house, that they had all actually dined at General Hubert's, and were, moreover, very nearly related to him. After this intelligence reached them, the excellent good sense of the Miss Perkinses decided that a feeling of what they owed to themselves, rendered it absolutely necessary that they should in some way or other find means of becoming personally acquainted with the occupiers of the drawing room apartment. The matter was still in discussion between the two sisters, though more as to the feasibility of the object they had in view, than from any doubt as to the propriety of the measure, when it was observed by both the ladies, each from the window which she especially called her own, that several military gentlemen of different ages, but all, as Miss Matilda observed, looking perfectly like men of fashion, were coming and going, both morning and evening, in a manner that gave every reason to believe they were on terms of great intimacy with the family they came to visit. No one in any degree acquainted with the moral and social map of the ordinary existence of single ladies, living on their means, and passing a season at Brighton, can doubt for a moment that this discovery very sharply pricked the sides of the Miss Perkinses' intent of becoming acquainted with Mrs. O'Donagough. In fact, it produced a sort of irritating intensity of purpose, especially in the mind of the youngest sister, which could hardly fail, sooner or later, of achieving its object. " That is the third I have watched in and out to day," said Miss Matilda, in a voice that faltered from agitation as Cornet Dartmoor, of the Dragoons, passed out upon the pavement. " The third, is it? I have seen two," returned the less observant elder sister ; and then, after a moment of reflection, she added, " Of course, Matilda, The O'Donagoughs must see a great deal of the military at General Hubert's, and in that way I dare say they will get acquainted with them all." " Of course they do, Louisa. You don't suppose I was so stupid as to express any surprise at it? Quite the contrary ; for I am sure I should think it is the most unnatural thing in the world if they did not. What I was thinking of, and what I very often do think of, Louisa, was that all the vulgar, commonplace nonsense people talk about the disagreeableness of being an old maid, does not signify one single farthing. I, for one, despise it from the bottom of my heart. But what I know does signify, and in reality makes all the difference between being happy and miserable, is having the cleverness, good luck, or whatever it is, not to be left out of everything that is going on. And just to know gentlemen enough to speak to now and then, or to take a turn with one, like other people, if it was only for 2 or 3 minutes at a time." " That is perfectly true, my dear," replied Miss Perkins, " and it is just like your good sense and right way of thinking to say it. And it certainly is very hard, when people are as reasonable as you are, that they should not have what they wish." " I do think it is," said Matilda, with a gentle sigh ;" and I give you my word and honour, if I know my own heart, I should be perfectly contented and perfectly happy if we could but get into a gay set of acquaintance. But that I do wish for, and I won't deny it." " To be sure it would be a great blessing in every way," replied the elder sister, with much feeling. " What a difference it would make every day of our lives ! And of course, Matilda, you think about it still more than I do, and it is very natural you should, my dear. You are 5 years younger than I am, and that makes a great difference, particularly just at your age." " 5 years and 3 months," rejoined the younger. " My birthday is in September, almost the end, and yours in July, at the very beginning." " Very true, my dear, so it is indeed. And besides, you happen to be so very remarkably young looking, Matilda, that you look like a mere girl beside me. I am sure anybody in the world might take you for a dozen years younger than I am, at the very least, instead of 5, or 5 1/4." " I don't know about that, my dear Louisa," replied the younger sister, modestly. " I suppose I do look rather young, because everybody says so ; and besides, you don't make the most of yourself, and I am sure I wish you did. You would look as young again, if you would but take a little pains about it. That is one great reason of the difference, for I won't deny that I do take a great deal of pains, and so I think one ought. In my opinion, one owes it to oneself, and it is quite a duty not to neglect it." After this, there was a pause of some minutes, during which both sisters assiduously continued the needlework on which they were employed ; but, in fact, their silence proceeded more from the crowding of their ideas than from any lack of them. " What do you think would be the best way, Louisa ?" pronounced in an accent half playful, half shy, by Miss Matilda, were the next words uttered. " The best way to do what, my dear ?" responded Miss Louisa, with a look of perfect and most genuine innocence ; for, in truth, the mind of the elder sister had been occupied in meditation on the general question of old maidism, and not on that particular branch of it which concerned the officers who visited the family in the drawing room. " Don't you remember what we were talking about, sister? " said the younger, colouring a little, and somewhat in an accent of reproach. " Yes, to be sure I do, my dear. About the foolishness of caring so over much about being married." " No, no, I don't mean that, Louisa. We were talking of something quite different. I want you to say, sister, what you think would be the best and most ladylike way of making acquaintance with Mrs. O'Donagough. I am more and more convinced, the longer I think of it, that it ought to be done somehow or other. It is really too stupid sitting here like two fools, and speaking to nobody." " Dear me ! Think what a head I have got. If you will believe me, I didn't the least bit remember that we had been talking about that," replied the more resigned and tranquil minded elder sister. " Then I wish you would remember it, Louisa. It is excessively hard upon me to have everything left for me to manage. Do tell me, will you, at once, what you think would be the most advantageous way of beginning the acquaintance? Upon my word, Matilda, that is no easy thing to say. People so highly connected, you must remember, are never so easy of access as those that are less distinguished ; and though I don't mean to say that people in our situation of life, living as we do independently on our own fortunes, are not company for anybody, yet this family cannot be treated in the same way one might go to work with common ordinary ladies and gentlemen, like the Larkins last year at Hastings, you remember, or those dear, good natured Thompsons at Worthing." But to be sure, Matilda, it would be a very great thing for us both, and particularly for you, my dear, the place so full and all, it would be just everything, Louisa, and one way or another it must be managed. That fine tall girl of theirs looks the very picture of good nature, and Hannah says she isn't the least bit proud in any way, chattering away with her about the officers and everything else in the kindest manner possible," replied Miss Matilda eagerly. " I would give the world to know her." " Then suppose, my dear," replied the elder sister, " we were to try first with her. I have often observed that very young girls, and quite old gentlemen, are the easiest people to get acquainted with everywhere. Suppose, Matilda, we try speaking to the young lady first." " Stop a moment, will you ? I will hear the rest presently," cried Miss Matilda, suddenly starting from the work table, and hurrying out of the room. Her sister looked up as the door closed sharply behind her with some degree of surprise ; but being naturally of a composed temperament, she soon restored her attention wholly to the quilling of her tulle, nor ceased her occupation, twiddling it into becoming shape as a tour de bonnet, with rosebuds, ribbons, and so forth, till the entire fabric was complete. How long exactly this might have taken her she would have been at a loss to say ; but when the work was ended, and had been tried on and approved, Miss Perkins began to wonder where sister Matty might be, chiefly because she wanted her to pass judgment on her performance, and confirm her own conviction that it was very pretty indeed. Having looked at herself in the glass for several times, and out of the window upon the open sea as many, this sisterly longing was leading her towards the door, when she was stopped by hearing voices upon the stairs, in gay, laughing, loud conversation, one of which was her sister's. Miss Perkins hesitated a moment whether she should open the door in order to discover who Miss Matilda's merry companion might be, and had just decided that it would be quite ridiculous not to do it, when the desired operation was performed from the other side, and Miss Matilda entered side by side with Miss Patty O'Donagough, both talking together, fast and loud, and apparently the very best friends in the world. Miss Matilda Perkins bore in her hand a telescope, and the first words her sister distinctly heard and understood were, " Oh, my dear Miss O'Donagough, you must positively just come in and have a peep. You have no idea how exceedingly amusing it is, especially just now that it happens to be high water, with so many boats about and so many people bathing. This is Miss O'Donagough, sister. Miss Perkins, Miss O'Donagough. I was so lucky, Louisa, as just to meet this young lady as I came down from our room with the telescope, and I have just been so excessively amused by it upstairs that, when I saw her look with curiosity at the instrument, I could not resist my inclination to ask her in to look through it. Is it not good natured of her to come? So very kind and obliging." " I am very happy to see the young lady, I am sure, for that or any other reason," replied the elder sister, assiduously opening the window, and fixing the telescope commodiously. " It is a very nice clear glass, Miss O'Donagough, and this window has got such a beautiful view. It is certainly very amusing." " Now, isn't that first rate capital fun? " exclaimed Miss Patty, after a long steady gaze through the glass. " How I do envy you having such a beautiful amusement. You are looking through it all day long, ain't you, when you are not walking out? "" We do use it a good deal, certainly," replied Miss Matilda, with an expressive nod of the head. " But I do assure you, my dear Miss O'Donagough, that both my sister and myself shall always have the greatest pleasure in giving it up to you, or your mamma either, if you would do us the favour to call in and use it. Oh, for that, mamma will never get it out of my hands, I promise you, whenever I get into 'em. But it will be very good natured of you, I am sure, if you will let me come and have a peep sometimes." Both sisters were most earnest and eager in their assurances that there was nothing in the world they should like so well as seeing her come in and out 50 times a day if she liked it. " Well, then, I shall like it, you may depend upon it," replied Patty. " It will be such nice fun to gallop down here whenever I am tired of the old ones upstairs. Hannah told me you were very free, pleasant sort of ladies, and so you are." " I am sure it is very kind of you to say so," replied Miss Perkins, simpering, " and it will be no sacrifice at all for me to give up the telescope, because, of course, you know, my dear, I don't think so much of all those little gay amusements as my sister does. I am so many, many years older than Matilda, that it makes a great difference in all things of that sort, you know. So she and you, my dear young lady, may take the glass, turn and turn about, whenever you are here, and that would be better almost than having it all to yourself, for that might make your eyes ache, which would be a pity, I am sure, so beautiful as they are."
Patty repaid this amiable prelude to lasting friendship by saying, as she again put the glass to her eye, " I am sure you are monstrous kind and good natured, and so I shall tell mamma and papa too, and I shall make them both come and see you." A happy and triumphant look was exchanged between the sisters, while one of Patty's bright eyes was glued to the instrument, which made it, as she said, almost as pleasant to live in a house as upon the pier itself, and the other screwed up with skilful and most patient perseverance till she had carefully scanned every individual head within reach of her examination. The acquaintance thus happily begun between the drawing room and the parlour, progressed without the slightest drawback from the feelings of any individual concerned ; and many were the miles of hot walking spared Mrs. O'Donagough thereby, at the which she rejoiced not a little, for much as she loved to see and be seen, the excessive activity of her lively daughter had already caused her to pant and to blow under all the brilliance of a September sun at Brighton, for more hours than were quite agreeable to her age and size, and it soon became an understood thing between the new associates, that the Miss Perkinses should take care of Patty in all her long lounges backward and forward over the cliff and under the cliff, while in return Mrs. O'Donagough should chaperon them all about 3 times a day to the libraries, by which arrangement Miss Louisa got a great deal of very agreeable and improving conversation with Mrs. O'Donagough, and Miss Matilda very soon achieved a bowing and sometimes even a speaking acquaintance with all the gentlemen of Mr. O'Donagough's Brighton acquaintance. Their evening parties, too, were quite delightful. As the hours of daylight shortened, the hours for the card table lengthened, and the company of the Miss Perkinses was agreeable in every way. Nobody made tea for a party of gentlemen with so much skill, and so inexhaustible a stock of smiles as Miss Matilda ; and no one was ever so well qualified to teach new stitches to waning eyes as Miss Louisa, who, still struggling against spectacles herself, had discovered or invented a prodigious number of devices by which patterns would do just as well a little awry as not. In this way, the fortnight of her darling niece's absence made itself wings ; and when at length Mr. O'Donagough brought home the news that he had seen General Hubert on horseback, it was hailed by his lady with infinitely less ecstasy than he expected. " You don't seem half so much out of your wits, my dear, as I expected," observed Mr. O'Donagough, laughing in high good humour, the result probably of the propitious termination of his morning's amusement. " I thought you would begin singing and dancing when I told you that your beloved niece was come back." " Nonsense, Donny ! My singing and dancing days are over. However, of course I am very glad, and I shall take Patty to call there to morrow without fail. But the fact is, this place is so delightful — Patty is so much admired — the prawns and everything are so nice — those dear good Perkinses are such a comfort to me — and you are almost always in such high good humour, that I am sure I don't want nieces or nephews, or anybody else, to make me happy here. However, of course, I shall go and call to morrow." " Lor, mamma, I hope you will leave me behind if you do," exclaimed Miss Patty. " I had rather take one walk with Matilda Perkins, old as she is, than a dozen with that prig in petticoats, Elizabeth Hubert." " That's likely enough, darling," replied her mamma ;" but if you are the sharp girl I take you for, you'll soon find there's more reasons than one for making much of one's relations. You only just look at the Perkinses, Patty, when I talk of my niece, Mrs. Hubert, before them, or at Dacre, or Willis, or Foxcroft, or any one of the officers, and you'll see fast enough whether they are worth calling upon or not." " That's true as that the sun's in heaven, Patty," said her father, with great animation ;" so keep a proper look out, girl, or you and I shall be too." " La, what a fuss you are making !" said the young lady, tartly. " I never said I meant to cut 'em, did I ? But I suppose I may think them fograms and quizzes if I choose." " I don't care what you may think 'em, my black eyed beauty, if you do but take care to make the most of the cousinship," said her father. " So mind, miss, I shall question your mother about your behaviour to morrow, and if I hear of sour looks, or impertinent airs of any kind, you shall not bathe again as long as you stay at Brighton. Just mind that." Miss Patty tossed her head, but said no more ; for she, as well as her mamma, had learned to know when her papa was in earnest. It rarely happened but that when one parent admonished Miss O'Donagough, the other declared her to be peculiarly impeccable, and even praiseworthy on that particular point ; but in the present instance the case was otherwise. Mrs. O'Donagough was equally edified and gratified by the sentiments expressed by her husband, and to atone for any seeming indifference manifested by her own manner of receiving the intelligence of her elegant niece's return, she took an opportunity, about an hour afterwards, when both the Miss Perkinses and Lieutenant Foxcroft were present, to make her joy and gladness appear with such eloquent vehemence, as elicited from all the most cordial congratulations on the event. " You may be well proud of your niece, ma'am," said the lieutenant. " She's the first woman in Brighton, out and out." " Ah, Captain Foxcroft," replied Mrs. O'Donagough, who generally gave brevet rank to all her military acquaintance, " beautiful as she is, that is her least merit, I do assure you. Dear creature, I brought her up entirely myself, and therefore, you know, I may venture to speak for her mental qualities. To be sure I did take incessant pains with her. Every one of her accomplishments were of my own teaching, and I must say it, though I should not, that she has turned out exactly what I desired she should be." " How very gratifying !" exclaimed Miss Perkins. " And such an elegant creature, too !" subjoined Miss Matilda. " What a reward for all your care !"" I must say," added Mrs. O'Donagough, looking with an expression of ingenuous modesty in the face of Lieutenant Foxcroft, " I must say that she had both precept and example to help her, and I have the pleasure of knowing that the excellent match she made was entirely in consequence of my having fortunately attracted the attention of General Hubert. He was only Colonel Hubert then, but a most distinguished man in every way ; and when he found that Agnes had been brought up by me, he immediately paid his addresses to her. Cannot you guess, my dear Miss Perkins, how gratifying the remembrance of this must be to my feelings while witnessing their present conjugal happiness? " Oh, dear me ! Yes, I can indeed, Mrs. O'Donagough, and I hope and trust the same delightful thing will happen over again with your charming daughter." " I am sure you are very kind," returned the gratified mother. " Yes, that is exactly the sort of marriage I wish her to make — such high connections, you know — so every way desirable." And here, while Mr. O'Donagough and the lieutenant sat down to a game of piquet, Mrs. O'Donagough lowered her voice to a confidential whisper, while she poured into Miss Perkins's ear numberless interesting little particulars relative to many of her own youthful adventures, among which the touching episode of Lord Mucklebury's sending her a set of shells, long after they were parted for ever, was not forgotten. While this went on at one end of the room on the sofa, Patty, by a movement of the finger and a wink of the eye, invited Miss Matilda to station herself beside her at a still open window at the other. " Don't go on listening to mamma's prosing, Miss Matilda. There's no fun in that," said she, familiarly passing her arm through that of her new friend. " What a dear girl you are !" murmured Miss Matilda in reply. " And how I do wish you would always call me Matilda, without any Miss at all before it." " Do you ?" replied Patty, laughing. " So I will then, for I like monstrously to be intimate with you, because you are such a capital one for fun. Don't those dear feathers look beautiful in the moonlight, marching along under the windows ?"" That they do indeed, Patty," replied her friend, with a speaking pressure of the arm. " That's Captain Thwaites that's just passed. He's reckoned the handsomest man in Brighton ; but I think your cousin General Hubert is handsomer, though, to be sure, he is not quite so young." " He handsome ? What, that tall, thin, hideous, stiff old fellow ? Oh, Matilda ! if I could but show you one man you'd never think any other handsome again — that is, not very, very handsome, as long as ever you lived." " Indeed, Patty ? And who is that, my dear ?"" Hush ! Don't speak loud. But if I am to call you Matilda, and we are to be out and out real friends, I don't think it would be all right for me not to tell you everything. For real particular friends, you know, never have any secrets from one another." " Dear creature !" exclaimed Miss Matilda, in a whisper, with another affectionate pressure of the arm. " Tell me everything, then." " And you will never say a word about it to mamma, nor to your sister either ?"" No, not for the world, my dearest Patty." " Let us lean out of the window, then," said Miss O'Donagough, " and I will tell you the history of the only real lover I ever had that was worth talking about." With arms still interlaced, and heads projected, as if gazing on the beautiful effects of the moonbeams on the sea, the two friends there stood together till Patty had poured forth the whole history of Jack's tender attentions during the whole voyage from Sydney — his escape from drowning, his recovery from death on her lap, and lastly, the parting kiss by which, as she said, she well knew he meant to pledge his troth to her for life.
But, my darling girl, do you mean that he was a common sailor? Demanded the confidante in an accent of considerable surprise. A common sailor, indeed! Good gracious, no, Matilda. Before he went on shore, mamma found out that he was certainly somebody of very great consequence in disguise. Good heavens, my dear, you don't say so? What a complete adventure! And you so young, too! Oh, you lucky girl! Ain't I, Matilda? But when shall I see him again, dear? Do you think he will ever come to look for me? You may depend upon it, Patty. Etcetera, etcetera. And so the conversation went on, deepening in its tone of affectionate confidence, till 2 or 3 more officers came into the room, and then Miss Matilda was summoned to her well-loved place at the tea-table. But this did not happen till a very broad and lasting foundation of friendship had been laid between Miss Matilda Perkins and Miss Martha O'Donagough, a friendship which was not without a lasting influence on the happiness of both. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Widow Married, a sequel to The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. An Arrival. Affectionate Greetings amidst Latent Fears. The Disclosure. Manly Dignity and Female Vengeance. Determined Courage. A Trial of Strength. "Here's Aunt Betsey! Here's Aunt Betsey!" burst from the little Emily as she stood at the drawing-room windows the day after General Hubert, his wife and daughter returned to Brighton, and the words were accompanied with such gay clapping of the hands and such joyous skippings and boundings as left no doubt of the sort of welcome the great-great-aunt was likely to receive. "She is come indeed, mamma!" cried Elizabeth, throwing aside the book she was reading, and exhibiting very nearly as much childish glee as her younger sister. "May I run down to meet her?" "No, no, Elizabeth, let me go first and take her into the parlour," replied Mrs. Hubert. "She may be tired by her journey, dear, and may wish to be a little quiet at first." "Mamma, mamma! Compton is come too! Compton is handing Aunt Betsey out!" cried Emily, who still kept her post at the window. This was intelligence that seemed naturally and of necessity to break down all restraints, whether of ceremony or prudence, and mother and daughters very nearly vied with each other in the velocity with which they descended the stairs. The old lady and her young attendant were, however, in the hall by the time they reached it, and the presence of the young man proved to be of considerable utility, occupying his 2 sisters so completely for a minute or two, as to give Mrs. Hubert the power of leading her venerable aunt quietly to an armchair in the parlour, and hearing her declare that she had enjoyed the journey exceedingly, and was all the better for it. Mrs. Elizabeth Compton, as she was of course called by all the world, save the Hubert family, was at this time somewhat past 70, but never was the allotted 80 years and 10 borne with less consciousness of their weight than by this fragile-looking little spinster. She was as thin as it was well possible to be, her delicate little hand literally permitting light to be visible athwart its slight integuments; but all there was of her seemed imperishable, hardly partaking of the materials on which the wear and tear of time takes hold, and with an unquenched spirit in her eye that shot forth the same intellectual vigour it had ever done. "My dearest aunt!" cried Mrs. Hubert, fondly hanging over her, and looking into the cheerful face that smiled upon her with truly filial affection. "My dearest aunt, how delightful it is to see you thus so completely yourself, so perfectly well and unwearied after your long journey." "No very long journey, dearest Agnes. You see how I am accompanied. And I suppose you guess that I arrived in London the day before yesterday, and waited till my application to the Stephensons to run away with my young squire from their river abode at Richmond to your marine abode here could be forwarded and granted. Do you think the General will be very angry with me for stealing a week or 2 from the mathematics?" "Not past forgiveness, Aunt Betsey," replied Mrs. Hubert, now stepping towards the door by which her son was entering, and offering with successful rivalry a mother's arms to draw him from those of his sisters, which still encompassed him. "Is he not grown, mamma?" said Elizabeth. "Did you ever see anything so tall?" "Rarely at 16 minus 4 months," replied his mother, looking at him with irresistible admiration. "I only hope he does not mean to grow any taller." "I shall not answer that till I have measured myself with my father," said the boy, drawing himself up, and exhibiting as fine a face and person as nature ever bestowed. "My intention is to be exactly as tall as General Hubert, for as it is my full purpose and resolution to be a General Hubert myself, I really think the best thing I can do is to take him for my model. But do not talk of my being tall, Elizabeth is a perfect giantess. Thank heaven, however, I do not think she is quite so ugly as she was. What do you think about it, Aunt Betsey? Altogether, there never was a happier family meeting, every heart was overflowing with love and joy, and had it not been that the recollection of the O'Donagough family once or twice mantled the cheeks of Agnes with a blush which the old lady saw, but could by no means understand, every one of the little party might have been said to be in a state of perfect enjoyment. In about an hour after Mrs. Compton's arrival, and when she was comfortably installed in the drawing room, General Hubert returned from his ride, and again all the pleasure of the meeting was renewed. He was almost as fond of the eccentric old lady as Agnes herself, and felt a degree of pleasure from her society, and from the whimsical but shrewd spirit of her conversation, which is rarely communicated by persons of her age. But in the midst of their lively talk, there were moments when the brave general looked almost as embarrassed as his fair lady, upon recollecting the nature of the family news he had undertaken to communicate; and not even the sight of his noble looking boy, whom he had not seen since he left him at Sandhurst some months before, could drive Mrs. O'Donagough and her family from his head for 10 minutes together. At length, suddenly coming to the conviction, like Macbeth, that "If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly," he stopped his son Compton short in a very animated description which he was addressing to his mother and sisters of a royal review of which he had been recently a spectator, and saying laughingly, "Aides de camp, chargers, dukes, marquises, firing and charging." Mercy on me, Compton! You are like a magazine of powder in the very act of ignition. Do explode for the especial advantage of Elizabeth and Emily in the dining room, will you? For I really want to converse a little with your aunt. The gay young trio started up and made their exit, while the face of their mother, who perfectly comprehended the motive of the manoeuvre, instantly became of a very bright celestial rosy red, and she had actually the cowardice to walk to the other end of the room for her work-box, in order to have something on which to fix her eyes, that she might avoid the danger of encountering those of Aunt Betsey. "Ahem!" said the general. "Are you going to work, dear Agnes?" said the old lady. "Don't go to work yet, love. I have not looked at you half enough." "My dear aunt," began the general, and paused. "My dear general," returned the old lady, gaily, with her head a little on one side, and her bright eyes twinkling in his face with a look of exceeding pleasure, for there was nothing she liked better than to be called aunt by General Hubert. "My dear aunt, we have some news to tell you," he resumed, "and I am sorry to say that I am not quite sure you will like them." "Indeed! What can that be, I wonder? Montague is not ill, is he? I have seen all the rest of you. Pooh! Nonsense, General! Tell us your news, I do assure you I'm not in the least afraid to hear them." "Aunt Betsey, Mrs. O'Donagough and her family are come to England." A most perfect silence, which lasted at least 2 minutes, followed this announcement, and then the old lady said, in a sort of lively tone, peculiar to herself, quite indescribable, but exceedingly expressive of a little internal méchanceté, "Mrs. O'Donagough and her family arrived in England? Well, General Hubert, I really cannot conceive why you should imagine this news would not be agreeable to me. All persons, I believe, rather like to have their prophecies come true. Remember what that keen observer, the Dean of St. Patrick's, said. He'd rather that his friend should die than his prediction prove a lie. Then why, my dear sir, should you entertain any doubt of my heartfelt participation of your joy on this occasion? Look up, my dear Mrs. Hubert. Never mind your carpet work for a few minutes. Let me wish you joy, my dear. You are now about to reap the reward of all your unwearied and unceasing attentions to these amiable relatives. How you must enjoy the idea of it! And the General, too, just as his young family are growing up. What an advantage for them! Elizabeth in particular. I should think the young ladies must be nearly of the same age, and I cannot doubt that my niece, your aunt, Mrs. O'Donagough, formerly the widow Barnaby, keeping in mind the many proofs of affectionate remembrance which you have bestowed on her during the whole period of her absence, will indulge Miss Hubert with her daughter's company both in town and country as much as you could possibly desire. I really wish you heartily joy of this most happy family reunion. It is, as indeed you well know, no more than I was quite sure would happen ; but as you never appear to agree with me in this opinion, the circumstance must come upon you with all the additional delight of being unexpected. I wish you joy, General Hubert, heartily." General Hubert looked half angry at some parts of this harangue ; but before it was ended he had perfectly recovered his good humour, and said with a laugh that was at least half genuine, " Come, come, aunt Betsy, as you are great, be merciful. You certainly appear to have seen further into futurity than either Agnes or myself. I freely confess that I never thought these good people would return to England, and I will freely confess also, that I should have been quite as well pleased if they had not. But jesting apart, their arrival cannot in reality be matter of any very serious uneasiness to us, and I confess I feel not in the least degree doubtful but that I shall be able to guard my stronghold, wife, daughter, and all, against all the attacks which the O'Donagough faction may be able to bring against it." The flexible and speaking features of the little old lady's expressive face changed, as she listened to these words, from a sort of gaieté maligne to a look of lamb-like gentleness and submission. " Oh, dear me, General Hubert, how can you for a moment suppose I doubt it? Don't mind me or anything I say. It is only my foolish, joking way, you know. I should behave better if you had not all, young and old, conspired to spoil me. But do not fancy for a moment that I am not aware of the utter impossibility that you should blunder in any way." Agnes looked up at her aunt from the corner of her eye, and shook her head, though almost imperceptibly, as she listened to her ; but the unsuspicious general walked across the room to the venerable mystifier, and taking her hand, replied, " Thank you, my dear madam, for your confidence in me. Even Agnes must know by this time that it is impossible to pass through life without finding ourselves occasionally obliged to associate with persons extremely far from agreeable ; and the great secret, I believe, is to learn how this may be done without jostling against them." " I dare say it is," said Mrs. Compton, in the same gentle tone ;" and you must have had so much experience in the course of your varied and busy career, that it cannot be doubted but you must understand this better than most people — at any rate better than a poor old recluse like me." " Perhaps I do know something about such mysteries," replied General Hubert, smiling, and dropping into a chair close beside the old lady ;" and therefore I flatter myself that you will let me keep watch and ward over you all, and guard you from all social perils, let them come in what shape they may." " Happy are those so guarded !" responded Mrs. Elizabeth Compton, solemnly. Here again Mrs. Hubert looked into the face of her aunt ; but this time she did not shake her head, appearing, on the contrary, well satisfied at its expression, and looking herself more comfortable and at her ease than she had done since the discussion began. " Perhaps," said General Hubert, now fearlessly resuming the theme, " perhaps, under any other circumstances, I should be disposed to shake off the acquaintance of this O'Donagough family altogether, and so get rid of the inconvenience, as you would do, my dear lady, at once. But I confess, after our long correspondence, it strikes me that there would be something very pusillanimous in this, and that it would look vastly as if we were conscious of not having tact and savoir faire enough to take care of ourselves." " A soldier and afraid !" cried Mrs. Compton, briskly. " Nay, then, my dear general, if such be your feeling, who can wonder at your scorning what none but an old woman, perhaps, would deem the better part of valour? But tell me, dears, in what part of England do our recovered relatives take up their abode?" General Hubert and his wife exchanged a furtive glance ; but the gentleman answered boldly, " I really do not know, dear aunt, where they mean to live. But at this moment I believe they are at Brighton." The old lady was engaged in neatly folding a silk scarf she had taken from her shoulders ; but on hearing these words, she stopped short in the middle of the operation, and remained for about a minute as still as if she had been shot ; and then, having taken rather a long breath, she resumed her employment, and pronounced very tranquilly the monosyllable, " Oh !" It was precisely at this moment that a servant entered the drawing room, and putting a visiting card into the hands of Mrs. Hubert, said, " Are you at home, ma'am ?" This discreet individual was the old butler, who, although he had received no orders to deny his mistress, felt doubtful whether the recent arrival of Mrs. Compton might not render the admission of company inconvenient. Mrs. Hubert changed colour as her eye glanced upon the card. " Who is it, Agnes ?" inquired the general. But Agnes, instead of answering, gave back the card to the servant with a silent movement of the head, which indicated that it was to be handed to his master.
There could hardly be a greater proof of the high consideration in which Mrs. Compton was held than that General Hubert coloured also as he read the same ; but he rallied instantly, and said, " This is Mrs. O'Donagough's card, my dear madam. Perhaps we'd better send down a word that we are engaged. You are too recently arrived to wish for company." " Decline seeing Mrs. O'Donagough on my account, General Hubert? " said the old lady, with a smile of ineffable sweetness. " Oh no ! I would set off for Compton Basset again instantly if I believed such a thing possible. I do assure you I shall be delighted to see her. I consider her coming just now as peculiarly fortunate." " Desire Mrs. O'Donagough to walk up," said the General. " This is quite an unexpected pleasure," said Mrs. Compton, turning towards Agnes. " I assure you I feel quite curious to see her." This was said so naturally, and, moreover, it appeared so very likely that the old lady might feel curious to see her travelled niece, that Mrs. Hubert was perfectly restored to composure by the assurance, and rose to receive her aunt and cousin with as little repugnance as if she had been alone. The entire composure was, however, a little shaken by the ardour of Mrs. O'Donagough's approach, who rushed forward with the same warmth of rapture that marked the first interview with her beloved Agnes upon her arrival ; and it required very considerable self-command on the part of Mrs. Hubert to endure without wincing the long, close hug bestowed upon her, conscious the while that aunt Betsey's eye was fixed upon her and the capacious mass by which she was enveloped. At length, however, she was released ; and then, with the sweet, gentle gracefulness which could not forsake her, even when withdrawing from the arms of Mrs. O'Donagough, she said, " Give me leave, Mrs. O'Donagough, to introduce you to your aunt Compton. It is so many years since you met, that it is probable neither would now recollect the other." Mrs. O'Donagough started a little, but immediately put herself in an attitude of great dignity, while, probably to the astonishment of all parties, Mrs. Compton rose from her chair, and placing her hands before her, made the lowest possible courtesy, saying as she did so, with a most courteous smile, " You wrong my memory, niece Agnes, and yes, I should surmise that of Mrs. Barnaby O'Donagough also. We are neither of us cast in moulds so common as to be easily forgotten. For myself, at least, I can declare, with all sincerity, that I should have recognised this lady as the daughter of Miss Martha Disett in any part of the world." " Well, ma'am, and I believe I can say as much for you," replied Mrs. O'Donagough, ceremoniously returning the courtesy. " You should have known me for Miss Martha Disett's daughter," retorted the old lady in her gayest voice. " No, ma'am, certainly not," replied the swelling Mrs. O'Donagough, filling a good sized sofa with her presence as she spoke. " I could hardly have mistaken you for my mother's daughter, I think ; but I should have known you for my father's sister anywhere." " I thought so, I thought so. And pray, is this beautiful young lady your daughter, ma'am? " said the whimsical spinster, fixing her looks upon Patty with a mixed expression of wonder and admiration. Mrs. O'Donagough looked for a moment as if she did not quite know what she would be at ; but her internal conviction of Patty's extreme beauty, and the indisputable glory of maternity which she knew attached to herself, and which now, for the first time, was displayed before the, of course, envious eyes of her old aunt, speedily restored her complacency, and she replied with an air that perfectly enchanted the old lady, " Yes, ma'am, this young lady is my daughter, Miss Martha O'Donagough, as remarkable, I beg to assure you, for the accomplishments of her mind, as for the beauty of her person ; though I bring her up with the very greatest care, to prevent anything like vanity entering her head, I don't scruple to allow that she is handsome before her face, because she well knows that handsome is as handsome does. Her excellent father, who is one of the best and most thoroughly gentlemanlike men in the world, has always taught her to understand that beauty is of no consequence whatever in comparison to good behaviour." " What a treasure she must be !" cried Mrs. Compton gently but fervently. " And so beautifully dressed too ! 'Tis easy to perceive, Mrs. Barnaby, O'Donagough I mean, that she is a young lady of great fortune." " Yes, ma'am, thank God ! The days are gone and over with me when I wanted anybody's help. Mr. O'Donagough is a man of fortune, and in every way a gentleman." " Indeed, ma'am, it seems to me that you are the most fortunate lady in the world," said Mrs. Compton, gravely. " And so I am, ma'am, and no thanks, I must say, to anybody but my own good conduct and knowledge how to conduct myself. However, I am willing, if other people are, to let bygones be bygones.
and only to remember that my relations are my relations, without raking up any disagreeable old stories about what's past." " I am sure, Mrs. O'Donagough," replied the old lady, in what might be almost called a voice of contrition, " I am sure we must all be very wicked people indeed, if we return such generosity on your part with ingratitude. I am grown older, and I hope wiser than I was, Mrs. O'Donagough, when I saw you last, and I hope my conduct will give proof of it." " Well, ma'am, it is never too late to mend," replied the large lady, bestowing a sort of encouraging nod upon the little one, whose figure, by comparison, hardly seemed to exceed the proportions of a fairy. " I dare say we shall get on very well together ; and as you took such a fancy to my niece Agnes because she was pretty, it's likely enough you may do the same by my daughter ; and if you do, you will find her everything that a gentleman's daughter ought to be, and as good and civil to you as if you were as handsome, and smart, and young as herself. Go over, Patty, and kiss your aunt Compton." The young lady rose, and so did the old lady also ; but no one, save Mrs. Hubert, in the least degree comprehended her feelings. " No, no, young lady," she said, waving her off with her hand, and walking with a quick step towards the door as she spoke. " No, no, no. I know better than to let the kisses of a young beauty be wasted on a little hunchbacked old woman like me. You must let me look at you and admire you, which I am sure I shall do without ceasing. But as to kissing, no, 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 the young lady knows better than that." With these words she slipped out of the room, and took refuge in one on the same floor, to which she had been already introduced as her own. " What a funny old woman !" cried Miss Patty, a little before the door was closed after her. " Hold your tongue, child," said Mrs. O'Donagough, rather sotto voce. " As we have made up all our old quarrels so well, I shan't let you put your own nose out of joint by any pertness, remember that. How wonderfully well the old lady takes care of herself," continued Mrs. O'Donagough, addressing Mrs. Hubert. " I declare I think she looks better than ever she did in her life. By the by, my dear Agnes, what was all that stuff she told us, about her being as rich as a Jew ? Don't you remember ? I suppose it was all a joke, wasn't it?" " Mrs. Compton is too generous to be very rich," replied Mrs. Hubert, gravely. " What, she still gives away all her little substance to beggars, does she? She need not have lived like a toad in a hole in her own farmhouse as she did, if she hadn't turned her back on her own relations, and given all she had to make herself a name among the poor. Your wife comes of a very good family, General Hubert, little as that queer old soul may make you think so." " I am fully aware, Mrs. O'Donagough, of Mrs. Elizabeth Compton's claims to respect in every way," replied General Hubert, with some stateliness. " Oh, dear me ! I didn't mean to doubt it, sir. I know too well what a gentleman is, to have any question of it. My own Mr. O'Donagough will, I am quite sure, conduct himself towards her exactly upon the same principle. But it is quite right, nevertheless, for the credit of the family, that you should both of you know that, notwithstanding her unaccountable queer looks and ways, she is a born gentlewoman." " Believe me, madam, I have never doubted it," replied General Hubert, rising as if to leave the room. " Will you excuse me, aunt," said Agnes, rising also, " if I leave you now to go to Mrs. Compton ? She is but just arrived from town, and may require some attention after her journey." " To be sure, my dear, you are quite right. I never preach what I don't practise. Let us all be attentive to the poor old soul. I am sure if she behaves but decent, I don't want ever to quarrel with her again. Come along, Patty. We shall find our party at the library, I suppose. I hope, my dear Agnes, that you and the general, and Elizabeth, will all give us the pleasure of your company to tea and a sandwich some evening. Aunt Betsey seems so mighty brisk, that perhaps she may come too, and I'll engage my word for it that Mr. O'Donagough will receive her with every politeness." Mrs. Hubert coloured, faltered, and finally turned an imploring look upon her husband, which he rightly interpreted into a petition that he would reply to Mrs. O'Donagough's invitation. " You are very kind, Mrs. O'Donagough," said he, stepping forward ;" but when Mrs. Elizabeth Compton is with us, we never answer for ourselves." " My goodness !" exclaimed she, with unfeigned surprise, " that is treating her with respect. But I suppose you have some reason for it. Upon my word, however, I would not engage to say that Mr. O'Donagough would go quite that length if ever she comes to stay with us. However, if you have really cockered her up to that pass, general,
I suppose I must send a written invitation in proper style, and then you may consult her and let me have a regular written answer. I shouldn't wonder if the old lady was to feel a little curiosity to see what sort of style we live in. She'll find a difference, Agnes, I can tell her, from the time when you and I first broiled over to Compton Basset, and found her stuck up in the middle of her bees. Do you remember?" "Perfectly," replied Mrs. Hubert. "He, he! What an old frump she was to me! Do you remember? But never mind. I have promised the poor old soul that bygones should be bygones, and so they shall for me. Come, Patty." For a minute or two after Mrs. O'Donagough and her daughter had left the room, General and Mrs. Hubert remained looking at each other in silence. At length Agnes said, "This will never do, Montague. We really must not let them meet again. It is impossible Mrs. O'Donagough should long remain insensible to the bitter quizzing aunt Betsey is pouring upon her." "I do request, my dear Agnes," replied the General, "that you will let things take their course. I have little doubt but that aunt Betsey will manage her gibes and her jestings too discreetly and too skilfully for any mischief to come, and even should the two ladies quarrel outright, it would be a matter of no great consequence. But the fact is, Agnes, that aunt Betsey's quizzings are rather directed against me than Mrs. O'Donagough. I understand her perfectly, dear whimsical little old soul, and entre nous, I am quite determined to overthrow her tactics. She wants to prove that we have acted very unwisely in neglecting her advice when she recommended us not to answer Mrs. O'Donagough's first letter from Australia, and I am determined to show her that I really know how to take care of myself and you too, even though the redoubted Barnaby, daughter, husband, and all, have had their claim to kindred fearlessly admitted." Agnes smiled. "So then," she said, "the business afoot is nothing less than a sharp encounter between the wits of General Hubert and Mrs. Elizabeth Compton. Eh bien, faites votre jeu, my husband. As it is utterly and altogether impossible that Mrs. O'Donagough should ever trouble my spirit more, except by troubling yours, I shall sit by and watch your manoeuvres as composedly as if you were performing a comedy expressly for my amusement. Neither am I in the least afraid of trusting my beloved aunt Betsey in your hands, though I suspect you mean to plague her a little, don't you?" "A little, perhaps," replied the General, laughing, "and upon my word she deserves it. She really seems to suppose that I and my race are in danger of being blighted and disgraced for evermore, by the overpowering influence of these Australian cousins. Don't you think she overrates their importance a little, Agnes?" "Why, yes, I hope she does. But indeed, Montague, if she goes on in the complimentary strain with them, I cannot answer for my gravity. The surprised stare of the young lady's enormous black eyes, and the comical struggle between gratified vanity and suspicious mistrust in the countenance of my aunt Barnaby are almost irresistible. What will you say to me if I laugh outright? And how on earth are we to keep Compton in order? You know aunt Betsey is in all things considerably too much inclined to charter the vehement exuberance of his saucy animal spirits, and I fear that if he should perchance take it into his head to amuse himself at the expense of my exotic relatives, she will hail him as an ally a great deal too joyfully. Upon my word, Montague, I think we should do very wisely if we moved our sea quarters to Eastbourne or Hastings." "And upon my word, Agnes, I am more nearly angry with you for saying so than I ever was in my life before. Should you really think it wise and reasonable if I were to permit myself and my household to be driven round the country from terror of what the O'Donagough family could do to us? Come, come, Agnes, this craven proposal only proceeds from a little covert inclination to take part with aunt Betsey against me, is it not so?" "I don't know, I assure you, Montague. I think we shall get into a scrape while you and aunt Betsey are running this tilt together." "Fear nothing, dearest, for I only mean to prove to the mischievous old lady that notwithstanding all her predictions, we have run into no danger whatever." "Well, then, I trust that you will soon succeed, and that your joke will be safely over. But I have stayed too long from her. Do you think I had better say anything to her about Mrs. O'Donagough, or let the subject drop?" "Decidedly say nothing about them, unless she leads to it herself, and I entreat, if she does this, and perseveres in the same tone of persiflage, that you will fool her to the top of her bent, and appear to understand everything she says literally." "This will be no easy task, Montague, if she pushes the joke much further. However, I will in all my best obey you, sir, and trust that the influence of my name may enable me to enact the vraie Agnes to your satisfaction." While this conversation took place at one end of the Marine Parade, Mrs. O'Donagough pursued her way in excellent spirits to the other. Miss Patty, who had scarcely ever heard the obnoxious name of aunt Betsey mentioned in her life, had now to listen to a great many very deep and shrewd observations concerning her. " It is no little matter we have done to day, Patty, I can tell you that," said Mrs. O'Donagough, with an accent which to the young lady seemed rather mysterious in its solemnity. " Some people say that that little crooked old woman is immensely rich. If she is — but that's neither here nor there, I won't pretend even to give an opinion upon it, only this much I will say, that it is perfectly and altogether beyond the reach of belief that General Hubert should let his wife make such a fuss about her if she is not." " She looks as if she had been buried 50 years and dug up again," observed the young lady. " That's a monstrous good description of her, Patty. But don't you let your wit outrun your discretion, darling. If she has scraped and hoarded up some money from what ought to have belonged to my poor dear father and nobody else, there is no reason under the sun why it shouldn't every farthing come to you. Everybody that ever heard of her knows that she is the most capricious old soul alive, first taking a fancy to one person and then to another. All of a sudden once, for no reason in the world that anybody could find out, she took it into her head to spend nobody knows how much money in dressing your cousin Agnes from top to toe, and sending her off miles and miles from home to a fine school ; and to my certain knowledge, she had never seen the child above once or twice before. I was by when she took the fancy into her head, and I am as sure that it was for no other reason in the world than just because the girl looked pretty when she took off her bonnet and shook back her curls. I remember the stare she gave her, as well as if it was but yesterday. And do you think, Patty, I didn't see the stare she gave you to day? Agnes Willoughby was no more to be compared to you at the time I speak of than chalk to cheese, and I do believe in the bottom of my heart that if we have but wit enough to flatter her up a little and manage to put you forward well, you will have a better chance now than any of 'em." " Well, mamma," replied Patty, yawning, " all I have got to say is that if the old mummy has got some tin to give, I wish she'd come down with it at once, for I want to have a black silk cloak, trimmed with lace, like Matilda Perkins ; and if I don't get what she has hoarded soon, I shan't care a farthing about it at all, for I'm sure when I'm married, I shall expect my husband to shovel out the money whenever I may happen to want it." " Nonsense, Patty ! Don't talk so like an idiot," replied her mother. " You are old enough to know better. Or if you ain't, I'm sure you have no business with a black silk cloak trimmed with lace. How do you think, child, that you are to get this fine rich husband that is to shovel out such loads of money upon you? I should think you might know without my telling you, that a girl's chance of a good match is doubled and trebled 100,000 times over by her having some money herself." " Money enough to buy nice things and set her beauty off, of course she ought to have, and it's a sin and shame if she has not," replied Patty ;" but I don't see what she wants of anything more if she's handsome." " Why, then, you are not half such a clever girl as I took you for. Miss Martha. Take my word for it, that there is no man but what likes to get money with his wife, if he can catch it." " You don't mean to say, mamma," cried the young lady, colouring as red as scarlet, " you don't mean to say that such a girl as I am, ought to be married for her money? "" Lor a mercy, Patty, what a pepper box you are ! I never said any such thing, you little fool," replied her mother, laughing. " You need not be in such a fright. Nobody can know the value of fine eyes better than I do. My time is not so long gone by, I can tell you, but what I can remember what they are worth. But that's neither here nor there, Patty. The fact is, you must be civil and attentive to this crabbed old lady, and when your father hears what I shall tell him about her, he'll be sharp enough in looking after your behaviour, I'll engage for it." " Then let him give me a black silk cloak," said Patty. " I'll be hanged if I plague myself to be civil to that little old witch for nothing." By this time they had reached their own lodgings, and it was with great satisfaction that Mrs. O'Donagough found her husband in solitary possession of the drawing room, for her mind was full of important matter, and telling Patty that she had better go and call on the Perkinses, she seated herself exactly opposite to her spouse, and informed him of the unexpected interview she had had with her old aunt. She recounted at length the history of the perfect reconciliation which had taken place between them ; described the old lady's evident and frankly expressed admiration for Patty ; related the rumours which had reached her before she quitted England concerning her aunt's accumulated wealth ; and finally expressed her conviction that the best and wisest thing they could do would be to cultivate the acquaintance of the old lady most assiduously. " I shall say the same, my Barnaby," replied Mr. Allen O'Donagough, " if I can find out that you are right about the old queen's cash. But you don't seem over clear upon that point, and I have too much promising business upon my hands already to waste time in running after moonshine. I wonder how the old lady came, whether she staged it, or posted? You did not happen to hear, did you?" " No, Donny, I did not," replied his wife ;" but it would be a capital thing to find out, wouldn't it? It would be as good as a peep into her strong box." Mr. Allen O'Donagough did not answer, but sat musingly swinging one leg over the arm of his chair for a minute or more, then suddenly starting up, he said, " Let me find you here when I come back, Barnaby. I shall not be long." Had time been allowed, the lady might have questioned him as to his purpose, but there was not ; for before she could say " Stay," he was out of the room, and in the next moment she heard the house door close after him. Though still unrecognised by any former acquaintance, Mr. Allen O'Donagough had fully renewed his intimacy with all the holes and corners, terrestrial and aquatic, with which Brighton, in common with all other watering places, abounds. To one of them he now made his way, and beckoning to him one of the satellites whom he knew as ever ready to do his bidding for sixpence, he instructed him to repair to the house of General Hubert, and inquire of the domestic who should answer the bell, if he could be so obliging as to tell him where Mrs. Elizabeth Compton's carriage put up. In less than 5 minutes after Mr. O'Donagough had pointed out the general's mansion to his agent, the fellow returned to him at his station in an obscure street close by, and told him that the lady's carriage was at the Wellington Arms. Having honourably paid the promised sixpence, Mr. O'Donagough proceeded to the stables indicated, and there had not only the satisfaction of seeing Mrs. Elizabeth Compton's handsome travelling carriage, but also a most respectable looking domestic, who stood by, evidently to superintend the various cleaning operations that it was undergoing within and without. Mr. O'Donagough approached, and fixed his eye on the lozenge with an air of an experienced herald. " This is Mrs. Elizabeth Compton's carriage, sir, is it not? " said he, civilly addressing the servant. " Yes, sir," replied the man, touching his hat. " I hope she is quite well? "" Quite well, sir, thank you." " She must be getting old now, good lady. Did she come down post all the way from London to day? "" Yes, sir. My mistress travels wonderfully well still. She came post from Exeter to London the other day without stopping above an hour on the road." " That is capital, indeed. Good morning." Yes, my Barnaby, the game is worth following. Her own carriage, post all the way from Exeter, and a servant that looks as if he might belong to a duke," said Mr. O'Donagough, re-entering his drawing room, and reseating himself in the chair he had left about 40 minutes before. " Bless my soul ! You don't say so !" exclaimed his wife in return. " What a sly old miser she must have been for years and years, to be sure ! But no matter for that, Donny. No matter how the money was scraped together, so as our Patty does but get hold of it. If she does but get half, it would be well worth having, you know. Her own carriage ! Just think ! Post all the way from Exeter ! Her own servant ! Think for a moment, my dear, whether the half of that would not be worth having ; and remember, that if she was to die to morrow, we have just exactly as good a right to it as the Huberts. My Patty, you know, is precisely the self same relation to her as Agnes. Don't you see? "" Yes, my dear, I see," replied Mr. Allen O'Donagough, " and a very pretty little sight it is, there's no doubt about that. All you have got to do is, to keep it in view, and come in at the death if you can." " Then I will immediately write an invitation to them all to spend the evening here on Wednesday next," said Mrs. O'Donagough. " Do, my dear," replied her spouse. " And if they come, I assure you I shall think very well of your chance." Mrs. O'Donagough only gave an intelligent nod in reply, and seating herself at the table, immediately composed the following note. " My dearest Agnes, — I cannot describe to you the pleasure it has given me to see my dear father's own sister again once more, and that, too, in a manner so much more agreeable than upon any former occasion. Thank Providence, my circumstances are such that I shall never want to be troublesome to her any more in any way ; and this must of course be a relief to her mind, dear old lady.
Will you, my dearest Agnes, have the kindness to present my most dutiful respects to her, and tell her that I should consider it as the very greatest honour and favour if she would come with you and the General and our dear Elizabeth to pass the evening with us on Wednesday next. I think that, if possible, our sea view is still more beautiful than yours. At least Patty says that at high water it beats all the rest of Brighton. Poor dear girl, she is positively longing to see her great aunt again. She has been telling her papa that she never in her whole life saw any old lady that she so much admired and felt so much inclined to love. Do, my dear Agnes, my own dear sister's only child, do exert yourself to obtain this great pleasure for us, and believe me, my beloved niece, your ever affectionate aunt, Martha O'Donagough. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of The Widow Married, a sequel to The Widow Barnaby by Frances Milton Trollope. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. An approved despatch, an essay of truth, preparation, military tactics, an affectionate welcome, family feelings, hospitality. The note of invitation being written, Mrs. O'Donagough rose, walked across the room, and putting it into her husband's hand, said, while she gave him an affectionate pat on the shoulder, "Read that, Donny, and tell me if you don't think I'm good for something." Mr. O'Donagough perused the billet with attention, and replied, "Yes, upon my honour you are, Barnaby. And if you carry this through, and get those stiff, formal people here to a regular evening party, you will do an uncommon good thing, and I shall give you more credit for that sort of talent, the most important that a woman can have, by the by, than ever I did in my life before." It was just at this moment, and while Mrs. O'Donagough was still rubbing her hands, and giving by her countenance every indication of measureless content, that Miss Patty entered the room. "What have you got there, papa?" she cried, gaily jumping forward towards him. "Give it to me, I will see it, that's Pa's. Mamma looks as if she were going to dance for joy about it." "Give it to her, Donny," said her mother, "and then she will see what is going on." Patty took the note, and having read it, exclaimed, raising both hands and eyes to heaven, "Well done, mamma! If you ain't the greatest liar that ever broke bread, I'll be hanged. Do you think the old soul will swallow all this? Lord, papa, when you see her, you will be ready to crack as I was. Love her? I love her? Nasty little withered old weasel! How can you write such lies, mamma?" "Patty," replied Mrs. O'Donagough, solemnly, "there is one truth which, if you do not know it already, it is time you should. There is no duty more necessary to learn in the state of which it has pleased Providence to place us, than that we must lie, as you vulgarly call it, when it is necessary. A wife and a mother, Patty, has other things to think of besides just her own conscience and convenience. Of course it is much easier to say the truth out, plump at once, and tell people that you don't like 'em if you don't. But I should like to know how that would answer. Never you trouble yourself about my lying, I beg. I will never lie more than it is my bounden duty to do so, and I certainly shall never neglect that for any object." "Your mother's a pattern, Patty," said Mr. O'Donagough, winking aside at his daughter; and then added more gravely, "I'll tell you what, my beauty, I expect she's got hold of a fine hand of cards just now, and neither you nor I must spoil the playing of them." "Bless your souls! Good people, I don't want to spoil anything," replied Patty, flinging the letter on the table. "Only I say, papa, mind one thing. If you expect that I'll palaver these nasty disagreeable people for nothing, you're mistaken. But if you will give me a black silk mantelet, trimmed with lace, just like Matilda Perkins, I'll engage to do whatever mamma wants with this little old mummy of an aunt. The old soul had sense enough to say that I need not kiss her, because I could make better use of my kisses than that, so I needn't cuddle her up as mamma does Mrs. Hubert, and I'm sure I couldn't, without making all her little bones crack and fall to pieces. But if you give me the cloak, you'll see how I'll smile and curtsy and behave pretty." "Get away with you," said her father, laughing. "You won't leave me a penny in my pocket with your coaxing ways, if I don't take care. Come, my dear," he added to his wife, "make haste, seal your note, and send it." "There's a difficulty about that, Mr. O'Donagough," she replied. "It will be very awkward sending the maid of the house with it.
Of course, if they come, we must hire a waiter, and take care to have everything in the very best possible style. That's the only way, depend upon it, to give us a fair chance against the Huberts. How can I manage, my dear, about sending the note without their seeing a maid servant?" " Give it to me. I'll send it by a fellow that shall look like a groom. That will do, I suppose," said Mr. O'Donagough. " Delightfully," replied his wife ; and the note was sent. When Mrs. Hubert joined her venerable aunt in her room, she found her in her usual mood, full of interest and affection about the children, Mr. Willoughby, the Stephensons, and all in short who were objects of interest and affection to Agnes herself. But all trace of persiflage was gone, and, as it seemed, all memory of Mrs. O'Donagough with it. After an hour's pleasant family gossip, they returned again to the drawing room, where they found the General engaged in reading the London papers which had just reached him. As if to atone for any petulance she might have shown in their late encounter, Mrs. Compton paused behind his chair as she passed, and laying her little hand on his shoulder, said, " Dear General, what a pleasure it is to see you all again !" He understood this as an amende, and accepted it. Rising from his chair, he took her hand, kissed it affectionately, and leading her to a sofa, sat down beside her, and entered into a conversation full of kindness and animation on both sides. In the midst of this a silver salver entered, bearing a note addressed to Mrs. General Hubert. Agnes took it, and glancing her eye at the direction, laid it, unopened, upon the table. " The servant wants for an answer," said the footman distinctly. " Who is that from, Agnes? " said the General. Mrs. Hubert took up the note again, as if to examine it for his satisfaction, but she coloured as she did so, and both her husband and her aunt at the same moment felt convinced that it was an envoi from Mrs. O'Donagough. " You need not wait, Philip," said General Hubert. " I will ring when the answer is ready." Mrs. Hubert, meanwhile, read her aunt's affectionate epistle in silence, and then put it into her husband's hand, who rose to receive it. " This good lady seems bent upon putting your patience to the proof, aunt Betsey," said he, after glancing his eye over the contents. " It is from Mrs. O'Donagough, and contains an invitation for you and for us to an evening party at her house next week." " May I know what she says? " demanded the old lady, sedately. General Hubert put the note into her hands. " Alas, General," said she, " I have not my eyes here, will you have the kindness to read it to me? " Agnes could not repress a smile as she watched the countenance of her husband on receiving this request, but there was no escape from the task, and he read aloud the affectionate effusion with perfect gravity and very sufficient distinctness. The eye of Agnes was fixed upon her aunt as he proceeded. At first, her countenance expressed a very natural inclination to smile, in which Mrs. Hubert frankly joined, feeling delighted that all mystification on the subject seemed at an end. But ere the lecture was completed, the mischievous little black eyes were soberly fixed on the carpet, the mouth pursed up in affected gravity, and every feature indicating a relapse into the same whimsical mood which had seized upon her on learning the arrival of her niece in England. " I presume we shall be of one mind as to the answer to this epistle? " said General Hubert, throwing the note upon the table. " Indeed I hope so," replied Mrs. Compton, meekly. The General did not quite like the accent, and looking in her face, read there, plainly enough, her renewed purpose of teasing him. Had he at that moment wisely determined to lay down his arms, confess himself exceedingly annoyed at the result of his own indiscretion, and shown himself inclined to allow that they should have done better had they followed her advice, Mrs. Compton would have given him no further trouble, they would all have acted in concert, and the O'Donagough plague would have been stayed. Unfortunately, however, such wisdom did not at the moment suit his humour, and he met her renewed banter in a tone as foreign from sincerity as her own. " Is the answer to be no or yes? " said he. " Surely we cannot refuse such an invitation as that," said the old lady, in a voice which seemed to deprecate the General's suspected harshness of purpose. " I am quite sure that if you dream of doing so, it can be only on my account, and I cannot think of permitting it. Poor lady! How affectionately she writes! You really do seem, my dear Agnes, to have conquered by your incessant kindness, all the little asperities of her character. And that noble looking young lady, her daughter, too. What a fond, attaching sort of person she must be! Do, General Hubert, have the kindness to read over again that passage in which Mrs. O'Donagough expresses the young lady's feelings towards me." General Hubert cast a look upon his wife, half frowning, half laughing, and held out his hand again for the letter. But Agnes shook her head.
Notwithstanding her strong affection for the old lady, she did not quite approve the species of discipline she was bestowing upon her husband, and instead of giving back Mrs. O'Donagough's epistle, she opened it, and appeared to be pondering upon its contents. " You cannot be in earnest, aunt Betsy," said she, " in talking of accepting this invitation. I am sure you would find an evening so spent intolerably tedious." " Indeed, Agnes, you do not do me justice," replied Mrs. Compton. " The time has been certainly when I felt less kindly disposed to Mrs. O'Donagough than yourself and the General ; nay, so far did I carry my prejudice against her, that I fancied there might be something like imprudence in renewing an intercourse which circumstances had so completely interrupted. I confess all this ; but you are not to suppose me obstinate in error to such a degree as to refuse yielding my own judgment to that of General Hubert. And as to my finding the evening tedious, I am quite certain that I shall be more pleased and amused by it than anybody." " Pray, Agnes, let your aunt do as she likes," said General Hubert. " Write, my love, will you, and say that you accept the invitation." This was carrying the jest, if jest it might be called, considerably farther than Mrs. Hubert approved ; and after the pause of a moment, she determined upon venturing to address a remonstrance to both the parties, who thus, by the indulgence of a species of competition in wilfulness, half jest, half earnest, were, as she thought, running a great risk of getting into a scrape which would be equally disagreeable to both. But as she raised her head to speak, she encountered the eyes of her husband, who, evidently suspecting her purpose, appeared determined to prevent it by giving her a look that recalled at once his injunctions on the subject, and her own promise to comply with them. " Here is your desk, Agnes," he said. " Do not keep the servant longer waiting." Agnes took paper and a pen, but again she paused ere she used them. " Are you really in earnest, my dear aunt, in saying that you intend to pass an evening with Mrs. O'Donagough? " said she. " Pray, Agnes, do not doubt my word when I have given it to you," replied Mrs. Compton, very gravely. So a civil note, accepting the invitation, was written and despatched. The manner of its reception very clearly proved its importance. Mr. O'Donagough himself indeed said but little, but that little was impressive. " General Hubert and his family are then actually coming to pass the evening here on your invitation, my wife? " said he. " Go on as you have begun, my Barnaby, and I may have to buy a court dress for you yet." It was not from seeing any improbability of the event predicted that Mrs. O'Donagough paid little attention to the prediction at that moment ; on the contrary, her feelings might rather be expressed by the French phrase, "Ça va, sans mot dire," but gaily snapping her fingers, she only replied, " Let me alone, Donny, and you'll see sights before we've done." Having uttered these sibylline words, Mrs. O'Donagough left the room, and sought, as all ladies under such circumstances do, to get together a female committee for the despatch of business. More rapidly than most persons of her age and size could have performed the feat, she descended to the parlour of the Miss Perkinses, and fortunately found them, together with Patty, in full enjoyment of the open window and the telescope. Had the room been unoccupied, not all Mrs. O'Donagough's triumphant feelings would have saved her from a state of positive suffering, for the same delightful exhilaration of spirits which then made her eloquent, would have swelled her bosom almost to bursting had she found no friends to share it. She entered with the important note open in her hand. " So here you are, my dear girls. I'm monstrous glad I have found you, for I have 50 things to say. In the first place, my dear Miss Perkinses, I hope you have no engagement for Wednesday evening next, for I want you to pass it with us." " Oh, my dear madam," replied the elder sister, " I am sure your kindness and hospitality know no bounds. We shall be most happy to wait upon you." " If I had 50 engagements," said Miss Matilda, " you may depend upon it I should not keep one of them if you asked me the same evening. Should I, Patty? " she said affectionately, squeezing the arm of Miss O'Donagough, which rested upon hers. " You are a dear good girl, Matilda," replied Mrs. O'Donagough, with chuckling good humour, " and this time I flatter myself I shall give you a party worth having. I know you admire both General Hubert and his lady, and they will be with us on Wednesday." Not all Mrs. O'Donagough's efforts to assume a tone of nonchalance as she said this could prevent a degree of lisping affectation from pervading her delivery of the important names, but the two Miss Perkinses were too much excited to remark it. " You don't say so !" honestly exclaimed the elder, without attempting to disguise either her surprise or pleasure.
This is kind, ma'am, indeed. I heard somebody say at the library that they were going to meet them at the Pavilion next week. Isn't it kind to ask us, Matilda? " Mrs. O'Donagough is always kind," replied the younger, with great decorum, " and I shall have much pleasure in meeting the General and his lady, because I really admire them. One meets such multitudes of people that visit at the Pavilion, that it is not that circumstance which strikes me. But the near relations of friends I value so greatly cannot but be interesting to me." " That's just like you, Matilda," replied the fond aunt of Mrs. Hubert. " And you will like too, I know, and for the same kind reason, to meet my rich old aunt, as well as my elegant niece. This old lady, Mrs. Elizabeth Compton, is not, I promise you, the least important personage of the party. She is the maiden sister of my late dear father, is as rich as a Jew, and looks, as I have good reason to believe, with rather a partial eye on my saucy Patty here." " Oh, you dear lucky girl !" cried the affectionate Matilda, throwing her arms round her young friend's neck. " How delighted I am to hear it !"" Lord, what does money signify, Matilda, to a girl that's young and handsome ? If you think that I mean to be married for my money, you're out, I can tell you. I should have thought you had known better than that." " Married for your money, indeed ! What nonsense ! Who ever thought of that ?" replied Miss Matilda, playfully shoving the buxom Patty within sight of her own image in the glass. " But money's money for all that, my sweet girl." " And so it is, Matilda," cried Mrs. O'Donagough, approvingly, " and you can't do better than make Patty understand what that means. But now, my dear girls, we must come to business. Do you know, I have been thinking that it would be better to have the refreshments down here, if you'll lend us the room." To this proposal the two sisters replied together with such uniformity of accent, thought, and feeling, that it seemed as if one voice only uttered the joyful " Oh dear, yes ! We shall be so delighted !" which followed it. " Well, then, my dears, that's settled. And now I must inquire about a nice respectable looking man to wait. You don't happen, I suppose, to know of such a one, do you? "" I am quite sure I know where you can hear of one," replied Miss Perkins, " for I saw a notice up at a baker's shop in one of the cross streets. I can't exactly recollect where, but I don't doubt that I could find it." " What a dear, clever creature you are !" cried Mrs. O'Donagough, laying her two heavy hands on the slender arms of Miss Perkins. " Then I shall leave that job to you. Next, there's the wax candles to be thought of. We must get Mrs. Bates to let us have all the lamps and candlesticks she has got. I see you have branches to that pretty convex mirror over the sideboard. They will make the room look very elegant. But then there's the ice to be ordered, and cakes, and coffee, and cream. My poor head has work enough, hasn't it? That's the worst, you see, of giving parties in a lodging house, without one's own servants and things about one. Ah me ! My dears, if you had known me at Silverton Park, during the time of my first marriage with poor dear Mr. Barnaby, you would wonder to see me make such a fuss as this about receiving a visit from my own nearest relations. But a lodging house is but a lodging house after all, and I need not tell you that General Hubert is a high and mighty sort of personage, for that you can see at a glance." Nothing could more clearly show the elevated state of Mrs. O'Donagough's spirits than this allusion to her long forgotten park at Silverton. The name of that beloved domain had never passed her lips from the hour she had dwelt upon its beauties to Major Allen, during the days of their Clifton loves, to the present. The Miss Perkinses, however, caught it ere it fell to the ground, and it added much to the solidity of Mrs. O'Donagough's greatness in their estimation. Having settled with her female friends all they were to do for her, lugged about the tables and chairs a little, in order to rehearse the arrangements for Wednesday, and given Patty a hint as to the danger of straining her eyes by a too incessant use of the darling telescope, Mrs. O'Donagough bustled up stairs again, and approaching her husband with a coaxing, but not doubting demeanour, told him that she had settled everything with the dear Perkinses about having their room, and all other things they were to aid her in, and that she was come now for his share of the job. " And what's that to be ?" he demanded, instinctively putting his hand upon the pocket where his money was deposited. " Yes, Donny," said the lady, laughing, " that's it. At least, that's one part of what I want. I will take care, my dear, that everything shall be in excellent style, and I will only trouble you for two articles — money and officers. I dare say the general plays a good rubber, all officers do, you know. But at any rate we must have some red coats to make us look gay."
Her husband looked up at her as she spoke with a queer sort of expression that she could by no means understand. However, she was not very anxious for an interpretation of it, when he said, " And how much money do you want, my dear ?" She made her demand, which was complied with instantly, without an observation ; a style of doing business so novel and agreeable, that she immediately left the room in a most enviable state of spirits, to set off on a shopping expedition, without waiting for his answer to her second demand. It was not, therefore, till the very day of the party had arrived that she received a bit of information from her husband which greatly lessened her anticipations of gaiety for the evening. While enjoying a plate of her favourite prawns for breakfast, Mrs. O'Donagough suddenly exclaimed, " By the by, Donny, I am by no means sure that Foxcroft and Dartmoor and Willis will be over well pleased with having nothing but ice and cakes to eat after their rubber. I suspect that they'll miss their lobster salad and porter, and I'm sure I shall. What do you say to having a table laid in the corner of the dining room, with half a dozen knives and forks for those that like something substantial? And then, you know, if the Huberts go tolerably early, which they'll be sure to do, on account of that little creaky thing Aunt Betsey, you can bring your old friends up stairs again, for another rubber and a glass of toddy." " Have you done breakfast, Patty? " demanded Mr. O'Donagough. " All but this one prawn," replied the young lady, taking a solitary straggler that remained in the dish. " Well, then, go and take a look out with the glass, and see if the French steamer is in sight." This errand was of a nature to insure obedience, and Patty was out of the room in a moment. " I say, Mrs. O'Donagough, I have got a word or two for your private ear, so sit still a minute, if you please," said the husband. " Mercy on me ! What's the matter ?" replied his wife, somewhat startled both by the words and manner. " Nothing at all is the matter, unless you make a fool of yourself, and I think you know better than that." " I think so too," rejoined the lady, with rather a heightened colour. " But I wish you'd speak out." " Don't be afraid, I'll speak out fast enough. You told me the other day that I was to get officers for your party to night, and then you flew off in such a fuss that I had no time to say anything in answer. But it's time to tell you now, that you can have no officers to night, except the high and mighty Lieutenant General Hubert, Colonel of the Regiment of Dragoons." " And why not, I should like to know? Good gracious, O'Donagough, how very dull it will be." " It had better be dull than dangerous, Mrs. O'Donagough." " Dangerous ?" reiterated his wife. " What on earth do you mean ?"" I mean, my dear, that if I hope to do any good from the singular bit of luck which has brought me into kindred and acquaintance with Lieutenant General Hubert, I must not invite Messrs. Foxcroft, Dartmoor, and Willis to meet him." " Lord, Donny ! Do you suppose he is such a fool as to expect people will never ask anybody but generals to drink tea with him ?"" Not exactly that, Mrs. O'Donagough ; but he is a sort of man that one never invites to meet sporting gentlemen who live by their wits." " I am sure it is a shame, then, that you should invite such people here at all. How do you know that some of 'em might not fall in love with Patty some day, and a pretty match that would make, wouldn't it?" " I must be doing business, Mrs. O'Donagough, let me be where I will ; and you ought to know that, I should think, by this time. I'll take care that none, exactly of that sort, shall marry Patty, let them fall as much in love with her as they will ; and remember now, and always, if you please, that your business is not to ask questions about my company. I shall never give lobster salads to anybody that I can't make pay for them, neither shall I ever spoil a great game by mixing it up with a little one. People starting with less advantage than I do now, have managed to line their own purses, and get a peer for a daughter into the bargain. I see no reason why I may not do the same. But it won't come by inviting size Ace together to a tea party." " It is a monstrous bore," said Mrs. O'Donagough, " but I suppose you know best." " Probably, my dear," replied her spouse. " Make yourself and your girl and your room as fine as you will, and have your Miss Perkinses to help, if you like it. No great harm can come of that. They are not handsome enough to have any danger in them. But for my playfellows, let me keep them in the background when I think fit, and make no remarks upon it. Do as I would have you, and when you get to London you shall be rewarded for it." Though Mr. Allen O'Donagough did know best, his lady was not so ignorant as to be very greatly astonished at what she had heard, and being, as all the world allowed, a very sensible woman, she made the best of it ; hinting to the Miss Perkinses, with a judicious touch of mystery, that General Hubert was known by those who were nearly connected and intimate with him to have a multitude of whims, one of which was that he had a great dislike to associate with any but field officers. Patty stormed at hearing this, and declared that she wished all the Huberts, man, women, and child, were at the bottom of the sea ; but the Miss Perkinses knew better than to talk such nonsense, and even Miss Matilda felt capable of valuing the dignity of the association, though she was not insensible to the privations it brought with it. General Hubert's family, meanwhile, was not unmindful of the threatened festivity, though not quite so much occupied thereby as the hospitable projectors of it. The General himself was a little chafed at finding that he was manoeuvred into a scrape. But he managed extremely well to keep this feeling hid. His sweet wife suffered herself to be led, satisfied that she could not go very wrong if led by him ; and Mrs. Compton quietly enjoyed the conviction that she should soon bring General Hubert to confess there was more wisdom in keeping clear of a Mrs. Barnaby than in braving her approach, and trusting to dignity and skilful tactics to render her harmless. That she was in a fair way to achieve this desirable end there was no doubt, and it might have been as well if the venerable plotter had rested satisfied with what she had already done to insure it. But she had no intention of letting the gentleman off so easily. She had not forgotten the many quizzings she had brought upon herself during the last dozen years by warning him that half the globe did not afford distance sufficient to render intercourse and communion with a Barnaby safe. She remembered his jestings, gentle though they were, upon the circulating library as a source of knowledge respecting the conduct of human life ; and the result of all these reminiscences was a determination to push a little further the system she had so ably begun. Some excuse for the old lady's persevering mystifications may be found, perhaps, in the skill and pertinacity by which he, for whose especial advantage they were set in action, concealed their effect upon him. " Do all the dear children go with us to night? " said the old lady, looking round upon the assembled family on the morning of the eventful Wednesday. " Not any of them, I believe," replied Agnes quietly. " Surely you do not mean that, my dear? Is the General growing cautious already? Is it he who objects to the young people's being introduced to their cousin? "" No, indeed," said General Hubert, turning over the mighty pages of the Times newspapers with a little fracas. " No, indeed, Mrs. Compton, I have not interfered on the important subject." " Emily has not made her appearance at any evening parties as yet," said Mrs. Hubert, smiling. " But Elizabeth is just the same age as her cousin," observed the old lady, with an innocent air of pleading for indulgence. " I do hope you will let her go ; unless, indeed, General Hubert sees any objection to it." The General turned over another page of his noisy newspaper, but said nothing. " Elizabeth may go if she likes it," replied Agnes. " I would rather not go, mamma, if you please," said the young lady, slightly colouring. " Why not, my dear? " inquired Mrs. Compton, holding out her hand to invite the recusant to her side. Elizabeth went to her readily, and quite unconscious of the underplot that was going on, said very frankly, " Don't advise mamma to take me, aunt Compton, because I had a great deal rather stay at home with Emily." The old lady kissed her cordially, and said, " You will feel a little shy with your cousin at first, my dear, I dare say. Perhaps, indeed, it will take some time before you are thoroughly used to her. However, as you will have so many nice opportunities when you are all living together in London, I dare say your mamma and papa will let you remain with your sister this evening. We must have Compton with us, however. I hope he does not intend to forsake the old aunt who eloped with him." " I will go with you all the world over, aunt Betsy," replied the youth gaily. " Besides, I am exceedingly anxious to see my new cousin." At about 8:30 in the evening, General and Mrs. Hubert, their son, and venerable great aunt, drove to the residence of Mr. and Mrs. O'Donagough on the East Cliff. The moment in which their carriage stopped at the door was a happy one for the 5 persons assembled in the drawing room ; for during the last hour, a constantly increasing fever of expectation had been tormenting them all. " Well now, I hope you will be contented, mamma," cried Patty, from her station at the window. " 1, 2, 3, 4 of 'em. There's no Miss Elizabeth, though, but such a beautiful, tall young man. I do believe it is the Lord William I told you of, Matilda, only he is out of regimentals. It is good natured of them to bring him, at any rate. And now," she added, in the whisper which so often marked their mutual affection and confidence, " now I shan't care 3 straws about Foxcroft and Willis. Shall you Ere the question could be fully answered, the nice, respectable waiter threw wide the drawing room door, and announced the guests. Mrs. O'Donagough stood within 6 feet of it, radiant in crimson satin and blonde, and, as usual, ready to envelop her "darling Agnes" in an embrace, overflowing with lappets and love. Behind her, in single file, were stationed, first, her daughter, in a transparent dress of rose colour over shining white calico, her profuse black ringlets dropping from all parts of her head, her large eyes flashing their eager rays through the doorway to light upon the expected lord, and her bright complexion very unnecessarily heightened in its glowing splendour by a slight touch of her mamma's rouge. Next appeared Miss Matilda Perkins, a very model for careful dressers. Not a pin but did its duty well, not a plait nor a pucker but fulfilled the wearer's will, not a hair that produced not the effect of two. The more retiring elder sister was modestly sheltered behind her, conscious, perhaps, that the bracing energies of hope having failed her, the patience necessary for an effective past 40 toilette had failed her too, and that she was not sufficiently fait à peindre to appear in the foreground. Behind Miss Perkins, senior, stood Mr. Allen O'Donagough, sleek and sober in new broadcloth and a well-trimmed wig. Mrs. Compton and her niece Agnes entered arm in arm, an arrangement which seemed to puzzle Mrs. O'Donagough, for she could not conveniently embrace them both together, and being particularly desirous that the Misses Perkins should see the elegant Mrs. General Hubert enfolded in her arms, she stood for half an instant uncertain how to proceed. But a movement of Mr. O'Donagough favoured her purpose, for feeling himself rather too much thrown into the background by the two file of Perkinses, he made an active movement forward, and bowing profoundly, ventured to protrude a welcoming hand toward the ladies; whereupon Mrs. Compton withdrew her arm from that of Agnes, and suddenly dropped into a chair, as if too much fatigued to stand longer; being prepared, as it should seem, to go all lengths for the promotion of her project, short of actually touching her Australian relatives. The moment Mrs. Hubert stood alone, Mrs. O'Donagough pushed aside her husband's extended hand without ceremony, and, with a movement much too sudden to be either foreseen or resisted, once more enclosed her in a fond embrace, which lasted so long as to make Miss Perkins exclaim in a whisper to Mr. O'Donagough, " Dear me, what a pleasure it is to witness such affection ! Your lady perfectly dotes upon her niece, and I'm sure no wonder." Released at last, Mrs. Hubert moved on, shaking hands with Patty, and bowing to her father. But there was still much bustling ceremony to go through. The two Miss Perkinses were to be introduced, and General Hubert respectfully, affectionately, and gracefully welcomed. This was all admirably accomplished by Mrs. O'Donagough. A low courtesy, a smiling pressure of the hand, and a sort of swinging bow, by which she indicated to him an arm chair at the upper end of the room as his place, completed the tripartite operation. But when she found herself face to face with the young Compton, she was puzzled. Who or what he was, she could by no means conjecture. His remarkable height and manly appearance naturally enough prevented her from guessing that he was the son of Agnes ; so, having smiled upon him very graciously, and then recollecting who brought him there, turned round again and made him a courtesy, she set about insisting upon it that Mrs. Compton should change her place from the chair to the sofa. But the active old lady soon cut short her energetic pleadings by so rapidly making the movement she suggested, as to leave her suspended in the very middle of her indeed and indeed. It can hardly be denied, I believe, that when a party of ladies and gentlemen are in a position from any cause embarrassing, the gentlemen are more awkward than the ladies in their manner of enduring it. Mrs. Hubert ceased to feel embarrassee de sa personne, as soon as she had released it from the encircling arms of her aunt. Mrs. Compton, from the moment she had seated herself, began to enjoy the whole scene. Patty could be at no loss where or how to look from the moment Compton Hubert entered the room. The Miss Perkinses, each in her own way, were looking just as they ought to do ; and Mrs. O'Donagough was much too fully occupied in the expression of her family feelings to be conscious of any awkwardness at all. But General Hubert held his hat in his hand less gracefully, perhaps, than he had ever held it before, and Mr. O'Donagough would willingly have compounded for misdealing 3 times at his next batch of whist, could he have obtained thereby the power of addressing 3 sentences to the General with a tolerable appearance of ease. The first decisive change in this state of things was produced by Mrs. Compton saying, in her gay, clear voice, " Pray, Mrs. Hubert, have you remembered to introduce your son Compton to your aunt Barnaby? I beg pardon, I mean O'Donagough."
The old lady probably expected to produce some picturesque effects by thus throwing a new light upon the circle ; but it is probable that the result was even greater than she anticipated. No sooner did Mrs. O'Donagough catch her words than starting from her seat, her hands clasped, her head thrown forward, and her eager eyes advancing farther still, she rushed towards the startled young man, and laying her hands heavily on his head as if to bestow a blessing, began parting and pushing back his clustering curls in order to enable her, as she said, to examine the features so naturally and so inexpressibly dear to her heart. As she thus held the youth imprisoned, gazing the while into his forcibly upturned face, she discovered that he was strikingly like every member she had ever known of his mother's maternal ancestors ; and as she named them all in succession, she impressed a fervent kiss upon his brow in honour of each individual of the catalogue. The young man became exceedingly red, and when at length released, the manner in which he shook his handsome head, and set himself to rights again, had something so irresistibly ludicrous in it, that even the vexed general indulged in a smile, and his mother laughed outright. " Glorious creature !" exclaimed Mrs. O'Donagough, as soon as she had recovered her breath. " Good heaven, what a face ! Patty, come to me, my child. This is the first male descendant of my beloved father that I have ever seen. Dear, blessed spirit, how his heart would have rejoiced to look upon him ! Give your hand to your young cousin, Compton. I rejoice that his name is Compton, my own dear maiden name. Take her hand, Compton, and remember that your great-grandfather and her grandfather were the same." Compton Hubert was, perhaps, as saucy a student of 15 as Sandhurst ever sent forth, a peculiarity of temperament considerably increased by the unlimited indulgence of his aunt Betsey, the principal object of whose life had been, from the hour that he first gave indications of having a will of his own, to indulge that will in every possible way. She was, unluckily, but too able to perform this by the pertinacity with which General Hubert had resisted all her efforts to endow Agnes with her wealth during her own life. After long battling, this point had been settled according to his will, leaving her at liberty to spoil his second son, who before his birth was promised to her as her heir to her heart's content. Some counteracting influence was, of course, found in the good sense of his parents when he was with them, and that he was in truth a fine, frank-hearted, generous fellow, can no more be denied than that he was effronte as a page, when occasion permitted. It so happened that exactly at the moment when Mrs. O'Donagough was so pathetically entreating him to take his buxom cousin by the hand, the lad caught his aunt Compton's keen, twinkling black eye fixed upon him. It would not be easy to say what it was he read there, which encouraged the perpetration of such audacity, but certain it is, that instead of taking the young lady's hand as requested, he suddenly threw his arms round her neck and kissed her vehemently. Mrs. Compton drew out her pocket handkerchief, and its close application to her face prevented the possibility of ascertaining whether she laughed or frowned. Mrs. Hubert looked as grave as she could. The general exclaimed, almost unconsciously, " Compton !" Mr. O'Donagough grinned. Mrs. O'Donagough looked on with undisguised rapture, crossing her arms upon her own bosom with a sort of tender pressure that seemed to indicate that in her heart she embraced them both. The Miss Perkinses looked, turned away their heads, and looked again ; while Patty herself glowed, and pouted, and pushed, and laughed, and finally, when the young gentleman withdrew his arms, gave him a look which any spinsters, less devotedly attached to her than the Miss Perkinses, might have interpreted into a challenge to repeat the attack at the first favourable opportunity. This little interlude produced an excellent effect on the spirits of most of the party. The general and his lady, indeed, might have felt inclined, had the thing been possible, to remove themselves and their son elsewhere ; but the old lady was decidedly pleased by the adventure, nothing doubting that such and such like occurrences would speedily bring General Hubert to the state of contrition in which she was determined to see him. Mrs. O'Donagough immediately felt herself not only the great aunt in esse, but the mother-in-law in posse of the young gentleman ; while her calculating husband could not but see very substantial hopes of familiar companionship from such a beginning. The Miss Perkinses naturally felt themselves more at their ease in a little party so affectionately intimate together, and Patty snapped her fingers in her heart at all the Lord Williams in the garrison ; though at the same time her faithful lover Jack caused her secretly to breathe a reservation in his favour which, if interpreted, would have shown that she still intended to marry him if he asked her. " Ring the bell, Mr. O'D., will you, and let us have some tea and coffee. These hot evenings make one long for one's tea always, don't they, Matilda? " said Mrs. O'Donagough, giving the young lady she addressed a sidelong look of triumph and delight, as she passed before her to resume her station near the sofa on which the old lady and Agnes were sitting. The respectable waiter soon made his appearance, and laboured round and round the room with coffee, tea, cakes, and bread and butter, without intermission, for the space of 1 hour, the conversation meanwhile being carried on chiefly between Mrs. O'Donagough and Mrs. Hubert, and consisting almost entirely of questions and answers concerning Mr. Willoughby's state of health, habits, residence, and pursuits, the number, fatness, leanness, shortness, and tallness of Mr. Frederick Stephenson's children, and of the constant longing from which Mrs. O'Donagough had suffered during the whole of her residence abroad, to know all particulars respecting every relation and connection which Mrs. Hubert had upon earth, who must ever be, as she declared, more interesting to her than all the rest of the world beside. By the time the persevering waiter had completed the last round of cake and bread and butter which he considered necessary, the recently smuggled French clock on the chimney piece, being in excellent repair, audibly pronounced 10 warnings of the progressive, though not always rapid, march of time. Several of the party counted the strokes, and Mrs. Hubert was one of them. " I think the carriage must be here, General," said she, looking expressively at her husband. " We are always early," she added, turning to Mrs. O'Donagough, " when my aunt Compton is with us." " Good gracious, my dear Agnes !" she replied, in considerable agitation, " you won't be so cruel as to think of going yet. You will positively break our hearts if you go away without ice, or oranges, or anything. Ring the bell, Mr. O'D., if you please." Mr. O'Donagough did so sharply. The respectable waiter had not yet reached the bottom of the stairs, so the summons was answered with as little delay as his weariness would permit. " Let the dining parlour be ready for us directly, Potts," said Mrs. O'Donagough, very impressively ; and then, rising from her chair, she made her way by a brisk movement to the door, in time to reach him as he was passing through it, and whispered in his ear, audibly only to himself and Compton Hubert, who was carrying on a muttered tittering conversation with Patty near it, " Don't forget to light the wax candles by the mirror, and let us know the minute it is all ready." The interval which intervened before this announcement was made, certainly appeared a very long one, but it came at last ; upon which Mr. O'Donagough, according to previous orders often reiterated, approached the sofa, and, louting low, offered his arm to Mrs. Elizabeth Compton. " You are very obliging, sir," said the old lady briskly, " but General Hubert is always kind enough to take care of me." Thus called upon, the general drew near, and took the mischievous old woman under his protection, supporting her, as usual, very carefully, but certainly feeling a little provoked with her as the cause of all he had been enduring for the last 123 minutes. Thus rebuffed, Mr. Allen O'Donagough next preferred his attentions to Mrs. Hubert, who accepted them, unconscious that she took the same arm from which he had shrunk with so much terror some few years before at Clifton. The gentleman, however, remembered it, and laughed inwardly, well pleased at the hocus pocus sort of change his skill and fortune had jointly brought about. Then came the mistress of the fete, the gentle Miss Perkinses following after, not sorry, certainly, though deeply impressed with the honour they had enjoyed, that the period of its duration was drawing to a close, and not unmindful that, however long that period had appeared, the time which should follow, through which the ennobling recollection of it must last, would be the longer still. The procession was closed by Patty and her cousin Compton, the intimacy between them being greatly increased by the young lady's placing her hand upon the banister for a slide, and exclaiming, " Now then, which will be down first ?" On reaching the bottom of the stairs, Mrs. Compton, forgetting, or pretending to forget, that there was anything more to be done, walked briskly on towards the door of the house at which a servant of General Hubert's was stationed ; but Mrs. O'Donagough, on seeing her pass the open door of Miss Perkinson's parlour, heedless of the radiant light that issued thence, or of the waiter who stood beside the entrance, doing all that man could do, save laying his hands upon her, to give her notice that she was to enter there, on seeing this, Mrs. O'Donagough pushed past her husband and Mrs. Hubert, and with almost panting agitation, implored aunt Betsey and the general to come into the refreshment room and eat some ice. The necessity of compliance was so evident, that General Hubert immediately turned round, though the little hand which rested on his arm was almost withdrawn on his doing so. But apparently the old lady recollected herself, and felt aware that she was not performing well the part she had undertaken ; for on entering the parlour, she immediately seated herself at the table,
accepted everything that was offered to her, placing one thing aside as soon as another came, and thus, though tasting nothing, setting an example of great activity. The eldest Miss Perkins ventured to seat herself beside her, obligingly offering her services to procure whatever she might wish to take, which Mrs. Compton replied to by saying, " You are very kind, ma'am." But when the worthy Louisa perceived that ice, orange, custard, and cake were successively accepted, and successively placed aside, she could resist no longer, and gently ejaculated, " Dear me, ma'am, everything is so nice, yet you eat nothing." " I never taste anything after a 6 o'clock dinner, ma'am, excepting a glass of cold water," replied the old lady, very civilly, but still continuing to extend her hand to everything that was offered to her. This appearance of occupation on her part certainly kept the party together considerably longer than would have been the case without it ; but at length she turned herself completely round to General Hubert, who stood behind her, and said in her gayest, clearest accents, " Now then, General, I think we may go." This proposition now appeared too reasonable for any further opposition. Mrs. Hubert had taken an ice, Compton had fed his cousin Patty with 2, the General had swallowed a mouthful of execrable wine with his host, and the old lady had evidently done all she intended to do. Shawls, therefore, were sought and found, hands were shaken. " Coming out," was pronounced by Mrs. Hubert's footman from the door, and the party drove off. The only words uttered among them en route were, " I fear you must be very tired, my dear aunt," from Mrs. Hubert, and " Not the least in the world, quite the contrary," in reply from Mrs. Compton. CHAPTER XVII.